Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually takes us to anagrams, ancient astronomical instruments, and banned books.
To think that book banning is actually bringing us closer together.
But, as always, we have to get there. This week's episode is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmas Aryeh Leib Reuven ben Yaakov, whose yortzeit was on the 10th of Adar Rishon. If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming episode of the Parshah Rabbit Hole or give a small recurring donation to help me keep on digging, go to creativejudaism.com/donate. Okay, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Tetzaveh, tells us about the garments worn by the Kohen Gadol, one of which is the choshen, the breastplate. The choshen had 12 gemstones on it, and inscribed on each one was the name of one of the Shvatim, the 12 tribes of Israel. The Torah also tells us about a mysterious feature of the choshen, which is called the Urim and the Tumim. This is what it says in the Parsha. V'nesata el choshen hamishpat es ha'urim ve'es ha'tumim v'hayu al leiv Aaron b'voyoi lifnei Hashem. Place in the breastplate the Urim and the Tumim, and they will be over Aaron's heart when he comes before Hashem. So, the Urim and the Tumim are something that was placed in the choshen, but it's not exactly clear from the verse what they are. But we'll get to that. What we do know is that in many places throughout Tanakh and Midrash and Talmud, really all over the place, we learn that up until the destruction of the first temple, the Jews would consult the Urim V'Tumim for various questions of national importance.
A question.
And the Urim V'Tumim would give them answers. They were involved in dividing up the land of Israel amongst the 12 tribes, and they were often consulted about military strategy. So obviously a clairvoyant breastplate is a very cool idea, but I kept on trying to avoid the Urim V'Tumim as a rabbit hole topic, because I like to find the more obscure weird things in the Parsha. But I decided to start pulling at the thread to see where it would go, and I found a lot of really interesting stuff. So this is where the rabbit hole starts, with the Urim V'Tumim, what they were, how they worked, and where they pop up in unexpected places in Torah and Jewish history. So if you're ready to find out more, let's dive down that rabbit hole. Okay, so there are various opinions as to what the Urim V'Tumim were, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But it seemed to me that according to most of those opinions, they all agreed that the Urim V'Tumim were something that interacted with the stones on the choshen and allowed those stones to communicate answers to the questions presented to the Kohen Gadol. So before we get to what they were, we're going to start with what they did. The Gemara tells us that they were called Urim from the word or, meaning light, because they illuminated their words, they explained things. And they were called Tumim from the word tam, meaning complete, because its words were always completed, meaning they came true.
I meant what I said, and I said what I meant.
Now, I just want to point out that this thing about them illuminating their words is interesting. If you would have asked me before I started this rabbit hole what the Urim V'Tumim did, I would have said that the stones would glow, and the different letters on the stones would light up, and that would give the answers. And I bet a lot of you who are familiar with the Urim V'Tumim are thinking that as well. But Rashi says that illuminated here means conceptually. They clarified the answers to the question. And the next piece of Gemara we're going to look at also makes it seem pretty clear to me that there wasn't any glowing involved. I did see a couple of places that mention them lighting up, and it seems to me that the earliest one was Ramban, Nachmanides, but this doesn't seem to be the consensus. Okay, so the Gemara continues and tells us how it worked. It says, how is it done? Rabbi Yochanan says that the letters on the stones protruded, and Rish Lakish says that the letters rearranged themselves. So, according to Rabbi Yochanan, they would ask the question to the Kohen Gadol, and then a bunch of the letters from the names of the Shvatim, the tribes, would rise up and stick out a little bit. But according to Rish Lakish, the letters would move around and form words. Both options are very cool. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, that the letters would just protrude a little bit, but not actually move around and combine to form words, then you've got a little bit of a problem. The answers you get from the Urim V'Tumim are kind of cryptic. According to Rashi, that's just part of the process. He says that each letter would rise up, but stay in its place, and it was then up to the Kohen Gadol to interpret what it was saying, which means, according to Rashi, that the Kohen Gadol must have been very good at anagrams.
Holy anagrams, what's the answer?
But the Maharsha has an interesting way of solving this problem without involving anagrams. He says that according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan that the letters would stick up in place, it could have been that the letters protruded in series, and in the order that they protruded, that's how they should be combined. In which case, the Kohen Gadol doesn't have to be good at anagrams, but he does need to be good at memorizing a long string of letters, upside down, which is pretty impressive. So, this answer from the Maharsha also answers another question I had, which is, what if the answer requires more instances of a particular letter than is available on the stones? So, according to this, it's not a problem, because they're protruding one at a time, and they could get reused. Okay, so now we know what the Choshen with the Urim V'Tumim did to answer the questions. The Urim V'Tumim caused the letters engraved on the stones to either protrude a little bit or shift around to spell out answers to questions. Now let's get into what they were. We'll start with the simplest answer, which is mentioned in a few places, but I'll quote from Midrash Lekach Toiv because it was the easiest for me to find. It says very simply that the Urim V'Tumim were the 12 stones themselves. So, according to this, Urim V'Tumim is just another name given to the stones in the breastplate to describe what they did, that they illuminated questions and fulfilled their promises. But most commentators don't like the idea that the stones are the Urim V'Tumim, because the Torah tells us about the Choshen and its stones, and then says place the Urim V'Tumim on the breastplate, so the Urim V'Tumim must be something else. So, according to most commentaries, the length of the Choshen, the breastplate, was double its width, and then it was folded up to form a perfect square pocket. And it was inside this pocket that the Urim V'Tumim were kept. But there are different opinions as to what exactly that was kept in that pocket. Rashi says that the Urim V'Tumim was an inscription of the name of Hashem, which was placed inside of that pocket, and that's what illuminated and fulfilled. In other words, there was a piece of parchment or something that had the name of God written on it, and that was placed inside the pocket of the Choshen, and from there it powered the Choshen and made all the cool letter stuff happen. Okay, so while I was looking for different explanations of what the Urim V'Tumim were, the next place I looked was Ramban, Nachmanides. And he agrees with Rashi, but he mentions somebody who doesn't agree with Rashi, and that's Ibn Ezra. So I hopped on over to Ibn Ezra, and it was really long and very confusing, and it's not exactly clear what he thinks the Urim V'Tumim was. He starts out kind of like the other commentaries, saying that the Urim V'Tumim must be something else besides the Choshen and the stones, but then he has a few other criteria. He says that the Urim V'Tumim must be two different things, because that's what it says, Urim and Tumim. He also says that each of them must be comprised of multiple parts, because both of those words, Urim and Tumim, are plural. Then he rejects Rashi's answer, that the Urim V'Tumim is the name of God written on a slip of parchment, and he rejects this based on a ruling of Hai Goin. I looked for that tshuva that responds him from Hai Goin, but I couldn't find it. But based on various places that quoted it, it seems like it speaks negatively about using the name of God to perform wonders. So Ibn Ezra says that if Rashi would have seen that, he never would have said that the Urim V'Tumim were the name of God. So then he starts giving his own explanation of what he thinks it was, and as I said, it's very confusing. He even says it's confusing. He says that the secret of the Choshen is very deep, and that he'll hint to it, and perhaps those who understand heavenly knowledge will get it. He explains, like Rashi, that the Urim V'Tumim were kept inside the pocket of the Choshen, but he says that they were taken out when needed and placed on the outside of the Choshen. And then he continues and says that the Urim were made of gold and silver, but the Tumim were not. I just want to make a note here that apparently there are different versions of this, and in one of them, both the Urim and the Tumim are made of gold and silver. Anyways, then he talks about the significance of a particular number. He doesn't say which number here, but it seems based on what he was talking about earlier that it's the number 12, which makes sense because that's the number of tribes and the number of stones in the Choshen. And he says that the significance of this number has been completely proven in the higher and lower realms. Then he ends off by saying that if he tried to explain it all here, it would be longer than his entire commentary on the entire book of Shemais, Exodus. And he ends that only someone who has studied books of measurements and astronomy would understand it.
I see no reason for answers to be couched in riddles.
My answer is simply as your level of understanding makes possible.
Okay, so Ibn Ezra was right. I did not understand it. It sounds like he's saying that the Urim V'Tumim were two things that were made out of a bunch of metal and maybe some non-metal pieces that were assembled on the outside of the breastplate and then related in some way to an understanding of the stars and involved complicated calculations. Now, if you remember, I said before that Ramban, Nachmanides, mentions and rejects Ibn Ezra's explanation. And when he does that, he actually explains Ibn Ezra's approach a little bit more clearly. Ramban says that Ibn Ezra decided to exhibit his intelligence with regard to the Urim and the Tumim, saying that they were the work of a craftsman and made from gold and silver. And Ibn Ezra thought that they were similar to the models used by stargazers to know the thoughts of those who asked them questions. And then Ramban says that what Ibn Ezra said about this topic means nothing, and the Urim V'Tumim were like Rashi described it.
Goodbye, Ibn.
Okay, so now we're starting to get a clearer picture of what Ibn Ezra was talking about. Some sort of complicated device assembled from many metal parts used by stargazers to answer questions, which is starting to sound a lot like an astrolabe, which is an ancient instrument used to make astronomical measurements.
Wheel, telescope, astrolabe, compass. A ship's a ship.
Astrolabes were used in the ancient world for both astronomy and astrology, which were really very closely related up until a couple hundred years ago. Astrology was kind of the practical application of astronomy, and astrolabes were used for both. You could use an astrolabe to figure out the positions of stars and stuff just because you liked knowing how stars worked. That's astronomy. But you would also need to use the astrolabe to get those positions if you wanted to interpret those positions based on astrology, to predict the future and figure out what kind of day you're going to have based on when your birthday is. And it does make sense that Ibn Ezra might have been inclined to think this way. Ibn Ezra was an expert in both astronomy and astrology. There's actually a crater on the moon that's officially named for him. It's called Aben Ezra. And he wrote a whole book on how to use an astrolabe, and wrote several books on astrology. So there's definitely a very strong Ibn Ezra astrolabe connection. That doesn't necessarily mean that Ibn Ezra believed that the Urim V'Tumim was an astrolabe. As we saw earlier, his description was very cryptic, so we don't know exactly what it was. But it could be something like an astrolabe. But I dug around for Urim V'Tumim and astrolabe, and it does show up very clearly a little bit later on in history. Starting in the late 1100s, there was a huge controversy in the Jewish world between rationalists and traditionalists, and it escalated in the 12 and 1300s. Rashba, who was a student of Ramban, was involved in that controversy. In Seder HaDoros, which is a book of Jewish history compiled in the 1700s, it says, Rashba, who lived in Barcelona in the late 1200s and early 1300s, was a Chacham Gadol, a great scholar in all subjects. And during his time, they instituted a ban on studying any secular books except for medical books.
What are you reading, Andy?
Little Engine That Could. Do you think it would be banned?
So, it was pretty intense. And in one particular letter about the subject, the Rashba writes about these rationalist philosophers and says this: Their houses are filled with empty vessels, saying that the entire Torah from Bereshit until the giving of the Torah is metaphorical, and that Avram and Sarah represent matter and form, and that the 12 sons of Yaakov are the 12 astrological signs. And then he says that they even reached out their hands to the mitzvahs, meaning that they're not just introducing radical ideas about Jewish history and abstract concepts, but they even have radical interpretations about actual physical practice. And then he says that they say that the Urim V'Tumim is an astrolabe. So there are a few reasons why this is interesting to me. First of all, I think astrolabes are cool. Very steampunk. I like them. Second, it's very cool to me that the rabbit hole led me to a chapter of Jewish history that I really didn't know a lot about. But the most interesting part about this to me is the idea that astrology was considered a radical rationalistic approach that was upsetting to those who advocated for a more traditional absolute belief, even in things that may not make sense logically.
Here's a chance to open people's minds. Where are the free thinkers, the dreamers?
And that's interesting to me because today rationalists are probably bothered by astrology because astrology doesn't make rational sense and might feel superstitious. And then the rationalists questioning astrology might upset the traditionalists. So the relativity of that is fun to me. Okay, we're almost done, but I have one more thing I want to share with you. Remember earlier I mentioned a tshuva, a responsum from Haigoin, that Ibn Ezra said would make Rashi change his mind? So, while I was digging around trying to find that, I accidentally found a different tshuva from Haggain that technically has nothing to do with our topic, but I also think it kind of does have a lot to do with our topic. The Rosh quotes this answer from Haggain, and this is what it says. He was responding to a question about oaths. If someone swears an oath on a Sefer Tachnunim, basically a prayer book, a siddur, or other holy Jewish books, the question is, does it have the same status as someone who swears an oath on a Torah scroll? And he says that it does. He says that just like a Sefer Torah has the name of Hashem in it, the Siddur and other Jewish books also have the name of Hashem in it. And also, they often have actual verses from the Torah in them. But then he goes a step further and says that since these books contain all of the 22 letters of the Aleph-Beis, the Hebrew alphabet, then those letters can combine to form many names of Hashem and many principles of Torah. So, like I said, technically this has nothing to do with the Urim V'Tumim. It's about oaths. But to me, I feel like this is telling me that we all have our own kind of personal Urim V'Tumim. Any Jewish books we have, with all of their different ideas, and often even conflicting ideas, while those books are closed and without us thinking about the words or interpreting them or trying to make them do different things, just those letters on their own start shifting around and sliding and sorting themselves out and coalescing back into the words of Chumash. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if you have any questions or you want to tell me about something I missed, please put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. If you found any radical ideas down here that bothered you, just wait a while until they feel a little bit more traditional.